So I want to give a little bit of a recap. All right, but let's start with on 546. If you have it inside, a practical lesson, and it's okay if you don't have it inside, you could just listen. When meditation fails, you can always rely on Kabbalah's O, which is your willingness to accept God's authority, even when you can't discern his presence. Focus on Kabbalah's O, especially when you recite the Shema and when you bow during Shemona Esrei. So during the Shema, especially the verse of the Shema, it is about accepting God's authority. So even if you're not feeling the meditation, it's not fully resonating with you, just the main idea that we are accepting upon ourselves God's authority and ready to be a servant and to fulfill his will, that itself is the main theme of Shema that we're supposed to accept upon ourselves. And then during the Shemona Esrei, the Amida, and I think we spoke about this before, there's 18 blessings. And actually an additional one, a 19th was added later on. So there's 19 blessings in the Shemona Esrei in the prayers, but there's 4 times that we bow during the Amida. 2 at the beginning and 2 towards the end. The 2 towards the end is by the Modim, which is a prayer of thanksgiving we say at the end. And during that acknowledgement, during that Modim, which is a prayer of thanks, we bow our head slightly towards God. During those 4 little bows, again, we're not prostrating ourselves. We don't really do that anymore, besides for on Yom Kippur. But the subtle bow that we do with our head is supposed to be, and actually in Jewish law it says we're supposed to actually bow to the point that our spine, the bones of our spine stick up, like they protrude. Basically, it's supposed to be a little bit more of a bow than just the head. But during that time, our mindset, our mind has to be thinking about we are under God's authority, like a servant. Okay, and then let's just do a Hasidic thought, and then I want to give it more of a general recap. So Hasidic thought will be on 547 now, towards the bottom. Having emunah, and again, emunah is faith. By the way, we started giving a class, just before I read this one, we started giving a class on Wednesday evenings. It's more geared to Israelis. Like there's Israelis that come. It's more of a casual style of a class. And we're studying, we just started, we're studying a gate of Torah called the gates of bitachon, the gates of trust. In Hebrew, it's called Shar HaBitachon. And it's actually, it was written 900 years ago in Arabic, which was the Judeo-Arabic, like the Jewish language at the time in Spain. And it was written by a very renowned rabbi whose name is Rabbeinu Bechai. And he wrote a book called The Duties of the Heart, Chovat HaLevavot. He breaks it down that there's duties of the limbs, like giving charity or lighting Shabbos candles or putting on tefillin or things that we do with our limbs, which is most of the mitzvahs. But then there's duties on the heart. And one of these duties is the duty of the gate or the obligation of trust in God. So right now, where we're actually middle learning is the differences between emunah, which is faith, and trust. But it's beyond the scope of this class, but just as I see the opening words, it's talking about emunah, which is that faith that we're supposed to have in God and the reflection that comes from there. But let's just read it inside. Having emunah doesn't just mean that you believe in God's presence in the world. It can also refer to the process of training your mind's eye to constantly penetrate the superficial appearance of things to discern God. And we've talked about this in the past few weeks, that the Hebrew word for a profession, how do you say, I have a profession, I work? It's called an imun. An omen is a professional. So the word emunah, which is actually come from the same letters, is the idea of training yourself. That's what a professional does. They are trained. So emunah, which means faith, means not only to just believe in God, it also means to train yourself or to train your mind to see beyond the superficial appearance of things, to see godliness in everything. That's what emunah is. That's what faith is. That everything that happens in the world, you see it as coming from God. And therefore I have faith in God, because everything that God is doing to me is for the good. Everything that is in the world is for the good. The word, it's so beautiful how in Hebrew, everything is not just words to communicate so that I'm understood. Everything has a meaning of why this is the word. So the Hebrew word for emunah, which is faith, has the same root as the Hebrew word for professional or training, because the idea of belief and faith is not just I have blind faith. It's the idea of training yourself to see godliness in everything that happens. You delve or you dig beneath the superficial layer. Yes, Lynn. You're muted. I'm sorry.
Right. So the word for to train, like physical training, I think is the same word, or to have a trainer is immune. Like if you're working out, isn't it the same word? Exactly. So you're building muscles, or it's a process of having to work through it.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just happen, but it takes time, energy, and dedication. So.
Yeah. And the beauty of training also, there's some days that hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Some days you're sore.
Right. I'm a power lifter and I have a trainer, so that's why I know this. So and there's days I don't even want to go, but I have to because I've made a commitment. So, but also, isn't it the word amen, where we might see that I agree, or I acknowledge this, or Adonai Melech Ne'eman.
Absolutely. So it's from the same word amen. And we actually, I think, had it a few weeks ago. We talked about that word. I think it was in this class, but from that same root, exactly. Amen is supposed to mean I agree with you. I believe in what you're saying, right? I concur. It's coming from that same root. Awesome, good stuff. Okay, just continuing this thought. Second paragraph. Just as when a physicist handles a piece of metal, he sees atoms because his mind is so used to looking at the universe through the conceptual lens of science. You too can accustom yourself to see God in every worldly thing. You can train yourself in this discipline to the extent that you are aware of God's presence, even in the most mundane, practical tasks, like a skilled worker who trains his hands. Awesome. Cool. So that would conclude chapter 42, which is really awesome. And now what I'm going to try to do is, we are in the midst of a long process that many of you in our class, literally a year or two ago, we touched on the idea of meditation. And I said, we're going to get to the actual meditations in the 40s, in the chapters of the 40s. So now we're in the 40s. So I want to take a moment to pause because we have another 8 chapters of meditation. We're just getting into it. So we're in the middle of a long string of chapters, which started in chapter 41 and concludes all the way at the end of chapter 49. But if you can sum up what we're learning about in 2 words, it's the words in Hebrew, yira and ahava, which is fear and love of God. If I want to build that out to a full sentence, what I would say is, in this chapters that we're learning is, if you meditate on subjects that would lead you to love or awe, to love and have awe of God, you will experience this love and awe, and then you will do things on it or do things with it. So again, the point is the main theme of Tanya, that when you start with the mind, it inspires the heart and it spurs action. It starts with the mind, the heart, so the thinking, the feeling, and then it inspires action to happen, which is the main important part, the action. Again, think it, you will feel it, and you will do it. You know the adage that if you don't have experience, you can't get a job. But if you don't have a job, you don't get experience. So it kind of, which one comes first? You obviously need the job first, but who wants to hire a person that doesn't have any experience there? So similar to that, there's a statement in the Mishnah. It's the Mishnah of Ethics of the Fathers, of Pirkei Avot, that many have the custom. So in Jewish law, it says to study ethics of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, in the 6 weeks between Passover and Shavuot. But our custom is actually to continue the study throughout the entire summer months until Rosh Hashanah. We actually continue studying the ethics of the fathers. So there's a beautiful Mishnah that we're going to quote in chapter 43. And the Mishnah says, it's from chapter 3, Mishnah 17 of Ethics of the Fathers. And it says, if there's no fear, then there's no wisdom. And if there's no wisdom, there's no fear. In Hebrew, im ein yira in chachma, im ein chachma ein yira. If there's no fear, there's no wisdom. If there's no wisdom, there's no fear. So it's obviously which one comes first, the fear or the wisdom. So what the Alter Rebbe is going to explain or introduce in chapter 43 is actually not a contradiction. It's talking about two different levels of fear. Chapter 43 is talking about two different levels of yira. So when it says if you don't have fear, you don't have wisdom, it's talking about one lower level of fear. But then, in order to get the higher level of fear, you need to first have wisdom. If there's no wisdom, there's no fear. So in the past classes, we've been giving different translations for yira. We've given it a translation of fear or awe, reverence, respect. But if you remember, several times the Alter Rebbe quoted a story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And Lynn, I think you were here before your trip to Israel. The story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai on his deathbed. His students said, inspire us, give us a teaching. And he says, I pray that you fear God as much as you fear human beings. That was his teaching. And they said, that's it. And he says, that's the tall order. So using that understanding of fear, that you should have yira from a God as much as you have yira from a person, that's a yira that's more inhibition. The way I'm going to translate yira now, this lower level of yira, is inhibition, which means being more self-conscious, which means being more aware of your behavior. That's a lower level of yira that you feel, oh my gosh, God is right here. You're more aware of your behavior, just like in front of people that you respect. You don't just burp or do other things. You're more self-conscious of who you are, what you're doing. You're inhibiting yourself and restraining yourself. That's a lower level of yira. Where do you get this yira from? This feeling of inhibition? You get it from meditation. And what are you meditating on? You have to think about the vastness of the universe. When you think about just how enormous the universe is, how much God has done in the world, you feel very small. You restrain yourself, feeling, oh my gosh, look how enormous the universe is. I'm this little thing in this massive universe. So in this context, yira is the feeling of smallness, which is really the opposite of ahava. Ahava, or love, is the feeling of expansiveness. When you love someone, you want to be there to show up for that person. You're feeling vast, you have a feeling of vastness to do something for someone who I love. So yira, let me just rephrase this. Yira is like a feeling of self-containment, a feeling of unworthiness, a feeling of smallness. How do you get that feeling? When you meditate on how vast the world is. When you're sitting at night, a few weeks ago, we were in, Adina and I took the kids to a place called Arnold. Arnold is in the middle of nowhere. I don't know if anyone has been to Place Arnold. I'm sure Yaakov, you've probably driven by it also. It's I don't know, so 3 hours east of Marin. We rented a cabin for like literally a day and a half for like 2 nights. It was really nice. But when you sit outside at night, you see a million stars. It was gorgeous. It was absolutely beautiful. When you sit in the grass, just imagine you're sitting in the lawn at night and you're looking up and you see thousands and thousands and thousands of stars. You see the vastness of the world. Or what's that feeling? You feel, oh my gosh, I feel so tiny in this massive universe. Or when you go to the Grand Canyon, which I've never been, and it's on my bucket list to get to the Grand Canyon, you feel the massiveness of the world. So when you think of this, of how vast the world is, you feel how small you are. And obviously, the examples I just gave you is more in the physical world. But if you continue that meditation to also meditate on how vast and how much more vast the spiritual worlds are, all the angels and all the different levels, what we've spoken about as the different sphirot and the lights that are in there, and the different worlds that there are, it brings you to a feeling of smallness, a feeling of yira, a feeling of self-containment, a feeling of inhibition. That's a lower level of yira, a feeling of awe, a feeling of restraint. When you have this level of yira, you meditate on God's vastness in the world and in all the worlds, and you feel self-contained, that will spur you into doing mitzvahs. Feeling that this is my way of being part of the vastness of the world. I'm so small, and yet I have an opportunity to make a difference. So that's the first part of the Mishnah in Ethics of the Father statement, that if there's no yira, which means if there's no feeling of this self-restraint, of this containment, of this inhibition, of this lower level of yira, of this lower level of awe and reverence, then there's no chachma, which is the wisdom of God, the mitzvahs of God. So you need to have this yira that spurs you into doing the mitzvah. So first comes the meditation, the feeling of my smallness in this vast world, this meditation that leads you to awe and reverence of God. And then it gets you into doing the mitzvahs of God. But here in chapter 43, we're going to be introducing a higher level of yira. This higher level of yira is known in Hebrew as yiras boshes, which is, boshes literally means, Lynn, could you translate that word for me? Busha or boshet.
That would be ashamed. Is that the word ashamed?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Very good. Exactly. So yirat boshes is a fear that is developed from a feeling of shame. So it's a fear that comes from shame. And I think Mrs. Berger joined, but then is not here anymore. So I don't see her anymore on here. But there's a healthy level of shame. And when we were talking about this in chapter 41, I said we'll come to it in chapter 43. So we'll learn it inside together. But just to give you an intro, there's a healthy level of shame, and then a very unhealthy level of shame. In chapter 27, so a good year ago or more, we spoke about the difference between guilt and shame. That guilt comes from what I have done. You feel guilty. Shame is it comes from who I am. If shame is a feeling that I am inherently defective and flawed, that's unhealthy. That's not good at all. But if shame makes me feel uncomfortable to be taking up space in this beautiful world, a place of infinity of God, that's a healthy dose of shame. Shame makes you feel, oh my gosh, God is, I feel uncomfortable that I am taking up space. It's not a place that I did anything wrong. It's just my being here feels funny. It feels out of place. If you realize just how infinite God is, and that I am asserting my existence in his place of infinity, that's a feeling of shame. What am I doing? God is everything, God is everywhere, and I am encroaching on that. All I want to do is dissolve into oneness. What is my existence even doing here? You're feeling almost shame, like, why am I here? This is a much higher level of yira. This is called yiras boshas, the feeling, if you just appreciate the infinity of God and my existence is here. So this is a feeling of shame.
Could you spell that? Yiras what? What is it?
Oh, in Hebrew, it's in Hebrew, I'll spell it in both Hebrew and English. Boshes is Beis Vav Shin Taf. Boshet. In English, it would be Boshes or Et. Boshet.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes, Lynn.
Reminds me of Psalm 19, where David talks about the heavens declare, and the expanse, and pours forth speech, and he goes on and on how amazing it is. But then he ends with, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight. So he goes from, it sounds like he goes from, wow, this is amazing, like, oh my gosh.
Right.
You know?
I got to be a part of this.
Is that what you're talking about?
I think so. That idea of feeling that all I want to do is dissolve into the oneness of God.
Right.
It's a feeling of fear that is coming as a result of seeing God's infinity. So, and that's actually a piece that the Alter Rebbe is going to explain so beautifully. This feeling or this meditation of this fear, it comes not to spur you into doing an action of a mitzvah, which was the first level of fear. When you feel the vastness of God in the world and how I'm feeling self-contained, it makes me want to do a mitzvah. This is a feeling, a fear that comes as a result of doing a mitzvah. After seeing the infinity of God and God's wisdom of Torah and in the fulfillment of a mitzvah, that's the feeling of, wow, I'm taking up space in God's infinity. So that's the second part of the Mishnah. The first part of the Mishnah is, if there's no fear, there's no wisdom, which means first you need to have the fear of God, which is the lower level of fear, and then you could be involved in a mitzvah. You want to participate in the mitzvah and the Torah. The second level was, if there's no wisdom, there's no fear. This is a level where once you taste and you see the infinity of God in the mitzvah and the Torah, then it brings you to a higher level of fear, this level of shame, feeling, wow, all I want to do is take up less space and be part of God's oneness. And I have to explain that obviously a lot more, which is what chapter 43 will be about. And let's just take it one step at a time. The first level is, if you don't have this basic inhibition, which is to curb your desires, which means I feel like I am here. I have an ego. I have my self-existence. And therefore I have my desires. I have my wants. As long as you have your wants stated strongly and my desires wanting to be fulfilled, myself in full sight, you can't really achieve Torah and mitzvahs. Because the definition of a mitzvah is God's. The definition of me is myself. So until I curb my own desires, I'm not able to fully involve myself in the mitzvah of God. Of course, I could refrain myself, and that's where yira is coming about, is making less of yourself and more of God. That's awe. I'm self-containing myself. I'm going to inhibit my own will in order to be able to achieve Torah and mitzvahs. But then comes the next level is, if I want to dissolve into the oneness of God, you need to fully involve yourself in Torah and mitzvahs. So the result of living with his will is my dissolvement, less of myself and more of being to God. Let me explain this a little more. I'm explaining a lot of language, a lot of lingo. So let me break it up. We over and over again, we've been discussing the idea of bittul, which is humility or humbleness, surrender, I think is the right word I want to use. Surrendering oneself, surrendering myself, which is not a form of weakness we've discussed. It's an absolute strength to feel that it's not all about me. The right word for this, surrender, which we've talked about as bittul, is coming from a place of chachma. Chachma is a place that it's a window into the infinity. It's my wisdom, but it's my openness to what's beyond me. Or to use the words in Tanya, the way this English translation uses is chachma is inquiry. It's about what's beyond me. Opening myself up to what's beyond me. Whoops. Hold on, I think Mrs. Berger is trying to come in. That's good. So that's what chachma is. Chachma is inquiry of what's beyond me, a window into the infinite. Or if you actually take the word chachma and break it up, the way the Alter Rebbe did it earlier in Tanya, is chachma is from two words, koachma. It's a strength that I can't even pin what it is. It's ma, what is it? It's a curiosity of what's beyond me. Or in the words of King David in Tehillim, he says, "Hachachma me'ayin timatzeh." Wisdom comes from a place of ayin. From where? From nothingness. That's what humility is. Or in the words of the Mishnah, it says, "Eizahu chacham," who is a wise person? Haroeh et hanolad, who sees what is yet to come, who sees what's ahead, who, most of us, we are reactive. We react based on life's events around us. A chacham, a wise one, is one who sees what's going to develop even before it happens. They're able to see a step ahead. That's a chacham, a wise person, because it's not even there yet, and they're already not only predicting it, but they understand what's going to come, like the result of my actions. They're able to think ahead. Anyway, in other words, chachma is an appreciation of something that's beyond me. Chachma is a realization that nothing is independent of God. That's the point I want to get to. Chachma is the place of surrender where I'm realizing that it's not all about me, that I'm not independent, that we're all dependent on God, that only God lives absolutely. God is the absolute life. It's realizing that all the worlds don't live on their own. They're not independent of his being, of God's of God, the creator. They're all dependent on his creative power. By way of example, and I think we've given this example in the past, a person could appreciate the sun rays that come from the sun. It's going through your window, the sunlight, you're fully appreciative of it. Or if you're looking out in the sun and you see it on some beautiful days, you have the rays of the sun, you see them so beautifully around the sun, you marvel at them. But when you get, obviously we can't do this, but if you would get closer and closer and closer to the sun, an amazing thing happens. Those sun rays don't exist anymore. The sun rays only look like an existence outside of the sun. But the sun rays are no existence at all in the sun, because the only existence in the sun is the sun itself. Does that make sense? Similar to that, the only time a world could look like an existence is only outside what seems far away from God. But if you would actually take a moment and to reflect that everything is actually from God and in God, worlds are not independent of God. It's like the sun rays, that if you look in the source of where they come from, they actually don't exist. Because all that exists is the sun, not the rays. And therefore, if you look at the sun as God, that was the analogy, was the source, which is the sun, to the sun rays. If you look at everything, the sun rays, which in the analogy, in the analog would be the worlds or angels or everything else in the world, anything created, it actually is not a real existence. They're all dependent on God's existence. They're all in God. All there is really God's existence. If you will look at the world with this mindset, and actually look at yourself in this mindset, that you are not independent, you're not existing outside of God, but you and the world and everything in it is existing in God. All there is his existence. That is a feeling of yiras boshes, that everything is God. I'm not an independent existence outside of God. And that brings you to a place of shame. Wow, I am part of God. This is a higher level of fear, or in Aramaic, it's known as yira ila'ah, which is the supernal level of fear. You have a yira tata'ah, which is the lower level of fear. And the lower level of fear is talking about about the greatness of the world, the vastness of the world. Hashem made all of this and instills within me a feeling of fear and awe. But a deeper level is actually the exact opposite. The higher level of fear is realizing that all of this is nothing, that there is no existence. So let me just reiterate that. The lower level of fear is sitting on the lawn in your backyard at night and saying, wow, look at the magnitude of this world. Look at the vastness of the universe. Look at the amount of stars. Look at the amount of worlds and light and angels. Feeling that the world is so massive and I am so small. That's a feeling of fear, of awe, of reverence. A higher level is reflecting that all of this is really nothing. There is nothing else other than God. There's no independent existence other than God. And therefore, I need to make as little of an obstruction as possible, not to get in the way. That's a feeling of shame. Like, what am I doing here? Why am I taking up space? I don't want to cause any blockage. I want Hashem to shine right through me as if I'm not here. That's the feeling of shame. A very healthy and positive level of shame. So this is what chapter 43 is all about, which is, and just to summarize now, chapter 43 is about yira, awe, reverence of God, but more specifically, two levels of yira, two modes of yira. One, which is a lower level of yira, is needed first. And that's actually, if you remember from chapter 41, we started with saying that yira is needed first before love. So therefore, in chapter 43, he's going to go through two levels of yira and start with the very basic, which is the acceptance of God's authority, realizing that God is in this world and everything around us is God. And the vastness of the world, the magnitude of creation and the universe. And I'm here. So it's a feeling of self-restraint, self-containment that spurs you into saying, I'm going to do a mitzvah to be a part of this vastness of the world. Later, and that's going to be chapter 43, two levels of yira, and we're going to go through it inside together. But in chapter 44, we're then going to go through two levels of, what do you think? What do you think, Vivian? If in 43 we're going through two levels of yira, what would come next?
Two levels of ahava.
Awesome. Two levels of love of God. A love of God that comes, a lower level of God, of love of God that's going to come through appreciating this world. It's going to be called in Hebrew, Ahavat Olam, which means a love of God that comes from this world, from appreciating and seeing the nature of this world and everything in this world. Literally, actually, we in our evening prayers, one of the paragraphs before the Shema, it's called the blessing before the Shema, it actually starts with the word Ahavat Olam Ahavtan, which means an eternal love God has loved us with. Olam could mean eternal, and Olam could also mean world. So Ahavat Olam could mean an eternal love, but it could also mean a worldly love, or a love that comes from world. So that's how we're going to be translating it here later in chapter 44, that it's a love of God that comes from appreciating this world. And then you have a higher level of love, similar to the higher level of fear, which is going to be called Ahava Rabbah, which means the great love. And this level of love is really going to be only possible when Mashiach comes, that we can appreciate this level of love that's so in sync with God, so in love with God. It's really a gift from on high that tzaddikim have now, righteous ones, but most of us will appreciate really when Mashiach comes. Okay, that's my little intro for 43. Hopefully before 44, when we get more into the love, I'll give a little bit more of an intro. Any questions before we dig inside?
Yes.
Go ahead, Yaakov.
When you were talking about us, the shame and how we want to just, dissolve into Hashem, it keeps, and I think I brought this up before, but it keeps making me think about the statement about us being part of the DNA of Hashem, so because he created us out of his own essence, so therefore we are a part of him.
Absolutely.
Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. That's exactly where it comes from. So it's really tapping into that deeper self of feeling, wow, I really am part of this. I want to make sure that I'm not taking up space. I want to make sure that all you see shining in me is God, not self. So that's a feeling of shame, of wanting to make sure that it's not a feeling of my existence that is coming out in this world. Because what is that? Why is that? It's a feeling of God. Yeah, well said. Yeah, it is the DNA. Okay, cool. Let's see it inside now. We're probably not going to get that far today inside, but I'm happy we were able to get a good intro. And just for the record, chapter 43 seems as long, if not even longer, than chapter 42. So these chapters, for most of the 40s, are long chapters because it's really hashing out these levels of meditation that inspire the feeling that lead to the action. Okay, that's the point. But now we're getting into the meditations that inspire that feeling of love and fear. Again, the feel that we're trying to get the action. To get the action to be genuine and passionate, it needs to come with a feeling. You could force the action, but it's going to be I don't know what's the opposite of passionate. It's going to be without any passion. To get it passionate, you want it to be done with love. You want it to be done with a feeling of reverence. To get that feeling, you need to have a meditation. What are the meditations? So there's a bunch, and there's going to be a lower level of reverence that we're trying to get, which is from one level of meditation. And there's going to be a higher level of reverence that comes from a different method of meditation. And the same is with love. There's two levels of love, a lower level or a higher level. And those come from two different meditations that will spur two different types of actions. Okay, so chapter 43 inside will bring us to page 548. For those looking at the Kindle, I will pull it up, but it may take it a second to load. Meanwhile, I'm just already going to say the title. Chapter 43 is the full spectrum of reverence, or yira, and love, ahava. Section 1, expanded and contracted mind.
Etc. CHA City.
And here we go. Okay, hope everyone could see if you're looking on the screen. Let me make that a little bigger. Okay, chapter 43. So now the first few paragraphs, it's really just the author of this translation giving a summary like I just did, but obviously his words are good. So he goes like this. Chapter 43 continues the Tanya's practical guide to generate emotions for God, which began in chapter 41 and will continue to the end of chapter 50. So we got a good 10 chapters we're working our way through. In chapter 41, we were given an introduction to the importance of reverence, yira, and love, ava, and how to achieve them at a basic level. Chapter 42 elaborated further on ideas and techniques to generate reverence. Obviously, reverence and love can occur at different levels, but what is our register to calibrate these different levels? Our previous discussions have guided us mainly to recognize basic and lower forms of reverence and love. In this chapter, we will explore the higher, or in Aramaic, the ila'ah forms of these emotions and clarify exactly what distinguishes them from their lower counterparts. First, we will turn our attention to reverence. In the second half of this chapter, we will address love. And that's similar to the pattern that we learned already from chapter 41, that the foundation has to first be reverence, accepting God's authority, and then you can build on the love. Like any good relationship, you have to respect the other person, and then you could love them. But if you love them and don't respect them, it's bound to fail. You have to have that respect or that reverence for that other person, and then you build on it with love. So here it goes now, regarding this lower level, this lower reverence, which we began discussing in chapters 41 and 42, which we have defined as any reverence that directly inspires the observance of God's mitzvahs, right? When you have this reverence and right away it spurs you into an action, it spurs you into doing a mitzvah, both prohibitions and positive commands, which in the words of Psalms is to turn away from evil and do good, right? There's two levels, there's two parts to mitzvahs. There's the prohibitory ones, which is don't eat non-kosher, don't eat on Yom Kippur. And then there's the positive ones, which is put on tefillin and give charity, honor your parents, right? So there's the turn away from evil ones, and then there's the do good ones. So the feeling of yira, the lower level of reverence, should spur you into the observance of both of these mitzvahs, all of God's mitzvahs. Regarding this lower level, this lower reverence, our sages say or said, if there's no reverence, there's no wisdom, which was the first half of that Mishnah, right? First, you need the reverence, and then it leads you to wisdom, which is the mitzvahs of God. As we learned in chapter 23, the notion of both a lower reverence, which leads to the observance of the Torah, and a higher reverence, which results from Torah observance, is suggested by the Mishnah's teaching, and this is the full Mishnah's teaching. If there's no reverence, there's no wisdom. If there's no wisdom, then there's no reverence. The Mishnah's first half, or the Mishnah's first statement, if there's no reverence, there's no wisdom, points to a lower level of reverence that inspires you to observe the Torah, wisdom. The Mishnah's second statement, if there's no wisdom, which is Torah, then there's no reverence, suggests a higher level of reverence, which comes after Torah observance. And within the category of lower reverence, there is a contracted katnus frame of mind, and an expanded godless, expanded frame of mind, expanded one. Okay, so just to make sure the Mishnah is clear, because I don't want it to confuse you more than it should. There's two parts to the Mishnah. The Mishnah seems to be saying two opposites, that in order to have wisdom, you first have to have fear. But in order to have fear, you first have to have wisdom, which seems contradictory. Which one is it? Right? Like I told you before, you can't get a job without experience. You can't get experience without a job. So the way the Alter Rebbe is understanding the statement is actually not referring to the same level of yira that says you have to have yira and then you can have wisdom. But then you have to have wisdom in order to have yira. It's actually referring to two different levels of yira, a lower level and a higher level. You first have to have the lower level in order to go into God's wisdom, into God's Torah and mitzvahs. But then the second level of yira comes as a result of the Torah and mitzvahs. That when you have this Torah and mitzvahs and you get a taste into God's infinity and you see how everything in the world is really godly and godliness and nothing exists independent of God's existence, then once you have that wisdom, then it leads you to a higher form of yira, the yira of shame, the yiras boshes, the supernal yira. Okay. Now, the last thing we said is it leads you to two levels, one of contracting and one of expanding. Let's see what that means. Lower reverence from a contracted frame of mind. And if you're looking in the book, it's on 549 now. Lower level from a contracted frame of mind is what we have been discussing throughout chapters 41 and 42. The basic awareness that God is watching you. And number two, deducing his presence by looking at the contents of the physical world as his garments. And number three, the meditations before talis and tefillin. So we already discussed the feeling of feeling inhibited or contracted or restrained from the lower reverence. Now, the Tanya will briefly describe the lower reverence from an expanded frame of mind. So till now, we in chapter 41 and 42, the feeling of yira leads you to a feeling of contracting, a feeling of smallness. When you think about God is watching you, when you think about seeing the world, the vastness of the world, and seeing that everything in it is coming from God. But now it also could lead you to a feeling of expansiveness. How does that work? And we're going to conclude the class with this teaching, meaning to say that when this reverence is produced by meditating on God's greatness, when you meditate that God is great and the amount of greatness of God in this world, it's considered to be from an expanded frame of mind. The meditations in chapter 41 and 42 were from a contracted frame of mind because they didn't focus primarily on the greatness and awesomeness of God. They made you conscious that God is watching you and that the physical world veils his presence, but there wasn't a lot of detail about the wondrous power of God himself. That focus on God's greatness is the hallmark of an expanded mind meditation. So again, the expansiveness comes from meditating more about God's greatness. The contractedness, it wasn't focusing so much on God's greatness. It was more focusing how God is watching you. And that there's a physical world that is veiling his presence. But it wasn't so much about God, it was about the world that God made. But that leads you to a feeling of constraint or contractedness. But when you have a feeling of the greatness of God, it will lead you to a place of feeling expanded. That's a meditation of expansiveness. Let's see that inside. In an expanded mind meditation, you contemplate how he fills all worlds. And you ponder the awesomeness of God as expressed through the myriads of spiritual worlds he has created. In a contracted frame of mind, the emphasis is on you, how God is watching you, and how you feel his presence. But in an expanded state of mind, the emphasis is on God, how he manifests his greatness in all the spiritual worlds. Let me see. I see there's a question. Yes, Mrs. Berger. Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Okay, now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. A few weeks ago, we learned a meditation that said God is all powerful. He fills heaven and earth, wants to have a personal relationship with us, and he everything we do matters to him.
Beautiful. Very well.
I've been practicing it. It's in the book, and it seems to me like that covers both the higher level and the lower level of reverence for God, because we have the all-powerful and we also have God is watching me.
Actually, I agree with you. I was thinking the same thing, Mrs. Berger.
Oh, okay.
But it might not be right, but the way I've been studying and teaching it, that's the way it would come out. But yeah, learning it now, it almost seems that the feeling of meditation that is more about me, which means that God is watching over me and that I am submitting myself to God's authority, that's more about me. That leads me to a place of being contracted, feeling small, feeling minuscule in God's world. But when you think more about God's greatness, how God manifests his greatness in the world and on all the spiritual worlds, that brings you to a place of feeling expansiveness. I don't fully understand it yet. I think as we go along, hopefully it'll be clearer, but it does seem like there's two parts to it. There's a feeling of my perspective, which is of how God is in the world, and therefore it's more about me. That brings you to a place of feeling inhibited, or the feeling of yira, that I'm small, contracted. And then the feeling of how God is great and God's greatness is in the world. And that is more a feeling of expansiveness. But I don't have it clear myself yet. Yes, Lynn. It definitely needs more.
Yeah. So I was having a similar thought on my way home before class, and it was that I have my thoughts, my wills, my desires, and realizing my goal is to have those in line with God's will. So I'm doing God's will, like you said. So when people see me, they see the light of God. They don't see me, but they see God. Wow. So I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking, you know what? I don't think all my desires or my will, or the things that I think God wants me to accomplish in this life, they might not get accomplished in this life, but will get absorbed into the world to come. And it's not that I'm not supposed to work on those, but somehow they'll be finished in the world to come and accomplished perfectly. So that was like, there's the Olam Hazeh, which I'm to work in and do God's will. But at the same time, understand that I'm part of the Olam Haba, and what I do is important because it's what God's work, he's going to finish it, he's going to complete it, and I really don't have anything I can do with it, and to relax because his work is so much bigger than mine. So could it be a temporal thing of seeing our focus on us versus the focus from an eternal perspective?
Wow, amazing. I never thought of it from that way, Lynn. I like that. That's very nice. It could be from exactly the perspective, the way you see it. That's very nice. Wow, beautiful. What a nice meditation. That reflection is amazing. Wow. Yeah, but the idea of being accomplished in the world to come, definitely the idea of seeing the fruits of our labor will happen in the world to come. But I think we have to accomplish everything before in order for the world to come to happen. But yeah, both ways, I see the beauty in there. Awesome. All right, I think that will give us to the end of today's class. Beautiful. All right, so I'm very glad we already dug into a little bit of chapter 43, so you get a little bit of a taste. There's a lot more to come. The second half of the chapter will be focusing more on the love, which is also a really, really beautiful meditation. And we'll continue next week. Everyone have a great day. And a great
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For those that need to go, you could go. And Yaakov, yeah, definitely. Let me hear.
I was gonna